everyone for being here today. Augmentative communication is an area that's been contentious in certain areas, particularly between SLPs and BCBAs. And as many of you probably know, or you can tell from my credentials, I'm a duly certified SLP and BCBA. And so one of the things that I love to do and that I think is really important is to help our two fields be able to work together, to collaborate well. And so hopefully I'll be able to kind of dispel some of the myths or help people to work together better by better understanding where the differences in opinion are coming from and what research is telling us. Just to get back to telling you a bit about myself and ASHA, here goes my disclosure, because I think some people here are getting ASHA credits. So I work in my own private practice in Toronto, Ontario. It's called Action Potential Services. I provide services primarily for individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders. And a note on that, I'll talk more about that term in a minute. I provide them with services both in the areas outside of communication, so toileting and that sort of thing. And then in my speech pathology sort of scope of practice, I work on communication, both AAC and use of spoken language or mouth words, as well as feeding. Motor speech as well would be one of the areas I work in a lot. What else do I have to say for disclosures? I am registered with the College of Audiologists and Speech Language Pathologists of Ontario. And really cool thing, this recently happened on July 1st. BCBAs in Ontario, or behavior analysts in Ontario, are now finally regulated. And so I am now a member of the, hope I get the name right, College of Psychologists and Applied Behavior and Behavior Analysts of Ontario. I am also a member of ONTABA, the Ontario Association of Behavior Analysis, and I'm on the executive team of the SPABA, Speech Pathology Applied Behavior Analysis. So very happy to be here and to talk, as I said, about AAC and focus on some of the areas of controversy. Before I get specifically into AAC, when it comes to controversy, I should also bring up some of the terms that I know are controversial. So I mentioned the term neurodevelopmental disorders, and I know now a lot of people are using the term neurodivergent. And while I really respect a lot of the values of the neurodiversity movement, I know that there's some families who still probably prefer the term neurodevelopmental disorders. And so, if I was speaking directly to a family who prefers neurodivergent, I'd be using that terminology. But more generally, I use neurodevelopmental disorders. Similar to that is the terminology with regards to person first versus identity first. I thought Dr. Jason Travers in his talk yesterday did a really good job of explaining that piece. So similar to how I sometimes, or how I'll use neurodevelopmental disorders more generally, if I'm speaking to a client who prefers, or a learner or a family who prefers identity first language, that's what I'd use. But more generally, today I'll be using person first language. So our objectives will be learning to describe the factors to consider when selecting. Sorry, I'm trying to decide where my head should go to see it well. The factors to consider when selecting initial teaching strategies. I didn't mention this in the objectives, but we'll also be talking about strategies for determining which system would work best, which picture-based system. We'll list factors for considering when selecting initial vocabulary to use within a system, and describe strategies for teaching early word combinations. So what is AAC? There's two forms of AAC. So AAC basically is any form of communication other than what some people now are calling mouth words or spoken language, anything other than what we produce with our vocal tract. So that includes both aided and unaided. Unaided means any form of AAC we use that doesn't require materials. So that would be sign language. It would also include gestures and facial expressions. And then aided are forms of AAC where materials of some sort are needed. So there's various categories of aided AAC. Low tech, so this would be where Tacts, which is a commonly used form of communication, fits in. So a system where people exchange pictures to make their requests, and eventually to also make comments. There's also picture pointing systems, communication boards. A commonly used one in Ontario, where I am, is communication books. I think I have a picture of that. So that would be like the flip talk, the middle one at the top. Not sure if that's used as commonly out here. And then going into mid-text. So this is where we require some form of electronics. Often it's battery-powered things. And this would be things like the Tech Talk. Has anyone ever used one of those? Where it's a bunch of buttons on a static display. So it's not computer-based. Love it. This would be an example of a static display of mid-text. So it's not computer-based, but it's got buttons that you press that usually you have to record, or always you have to record someone's voice producing the messages ahead of time. And high tech. So this is where we get into the computer-based things, tablet-based, or the ones that are more dedicated devices, like the Dynabox, for example, would be a dedicated device. And we also have things like Proloquo to Go that are used on tablets. Before I continue, when I asked that question about who's ever used a Tech Talk, I realized I wanted to get a good idea about who in the room, like the various kinds of experiences that you've had. So who has worked with a learner already who has used AAC of some sort? Okay, so most people. And who is an SLP? Okay, and behavior analyst? And teachers? And any parents? Okay. So we've got a diverse audience in terms of experience, right? So I think I've mentioned most of these. This would be an example. I think a lot of people might be less familiar with those. Oh, well, actually, in the US, I know with insurance, a lot of companies are still wanting those kind of things used, right? But we see them a less and less in Ontario at this point. With tablets, well, we'll go into why, but tablets being cheaper and more accessible. So who needs AAC? This would be for individuals who do not yet speak, so they do not yet produce mouth words. Individuals who do speak, but their speech is difficult for people to understand, often due to motor speech difficulties, or could be due to anatomical differences. And then there's autistic people, and I'm using that term because often the people who talk about this call themselves autistic, who prefer to use AAC. So often these are adults who do use mouth words, can speak in full sentences and have conversations, but they feel in situations where they're anxious, they prefer to use AAC. And so for them, yeah, absolutely, AAC should be used. That's what their preference is. And this is a decision tree that I often use, or that I usually use when I'm trying to decide whether I'm going to introduce AAC or am I going to be working only on mouth words for a child or an adult who does not yet have any form of communication, any form of symbolic communication system. Before considering that, though, it is really important before you decide to either teach mouth words or to teach AAC, so to teach anything symbolic, we want to make sure that the individual has the pre-symbolic skills that are needed, or pre-linguistic skills. And so we want to make sure that they're already gesturing for things they want. It could be very early gestures, like they're reaching for items. And to make sure that that's possible, they need to have reinforcers, or they need to have things that they are interested in. Of course, if they don't, we build those in, but that we want to see that happening before a big focus happens on symbolic communication. And I'll also add that Tamara Casper, if some of you might have been at her lecture yesterday, her lectures are always amazing. I actually told her that she was my inspiration and part of the reason I became an SLP BCBA. She has recently, this actually was adapted from a slide of hers, and she has recently come up with the AMIC, the AMIC, with a couple of colleagues. And so she's now putting a big emphasis on not only having what I said, which is some pre-symbolic, some pre-linguistic skills before you go in with the symbolic systems. She has some very specific criteria, including wanting to see that the individual is persistent with their use of non-vocal communication or pre-linguistic communication. But once you've got that, once you know that, okay, we've got an individual who has communicative intent. And I will say also, usually people with autism that I've worked at, it's only been maybe a handful of kiddos who haven't had communicative intent or a lot of pre-symbolic skills that they're already using. So that would be more rare that they're using none. But like Tamara Casper says, we want to see that they're using them frequently enough that we have a good foundation. So once we've determined that they do, now our question is, should we be working on teaching only mouth words, or do we need AAC as well? So if we have an individual who has some sort of usable echoic system or echoic repertoire, we can stick with that. So these would be individuals who echo reliably, and when they echo, they have enough in their vocal repertoire, so enough different sounds and enough different sound sequences that they're able to echo clearly, that people would understand what they are saying when they use spoken language. Some of these individuals might have some difficulty with their motor speech or with their articulation. And we'll keep working on that. But at the same time, we can be teaching them words, word approximations that are going to be useful to them in the natural environment. And so they don't need AAC. But then we have some individuals who either don't echo at all yet, or they echo, but they echo a very small repertoire of sounds or sound sequences. So their speech is quite, if they do have some speech, it's quite unintelligible when they echo you. And so for them, we would introduce AAC, and at the same time, we're definitely not giving up on language at the same, or spoken language, I mean, we're at the same time as introducing AAC, we're also working on improving those echoics. So one big question with AAC is, what is this going to do for mouth words, for spoken language? Is it going to hinder it? And is it going to make it better? A lot of us, and I did this until, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, used to tell parents or people who are deciding on use of AAC, use AAC if you want to have vocal speech, because use of AAC will improve vocal speech or make it come along faster. Unfortunately, we don't really have data to support that, as much as it makes sense from a common sense point of view. So for example, Gans 2015, Schlosser and Wendt and White et al., they all talked about the effects of AAC on speech being either very variable, very modest. Basically, those are the two things. So it's very variable in the idea that some individuals using it will develop vocal speech. We don't know if it's because they were using the AAC device, but many also won't. And if they do, the effect, while they're using the AAC device during the time of the research study, the effects on speech or the improvements in speech have been small. But a good thing that can help us in deciding whether, when we're helping a parent, predict what's likely to happen if we introduce AAC, there are some variables or predictive variables or learner characteristics that have been found to make it more likely that if we introduce AAC, speech is more likely to come than if we did not introduce AAC. And those are having pre-existing echoic skills. So that means the ability to echo, with the ability to imitate speech. Having vocal speech. So that means not just echoing, but having the ability to produce spontaneous mouth words. And object exploration skills. So the ability to pick up a toy or just, an object and play with it, manipulate it. Doing that across multiple different toys, obviously. And the previous slide, I was talking generally about the effects of AAC on speech, and this slide is talking more specifically about the effects of PECs on speech. And as you can see, these slides are really research heavy, so sorry to be boring you if you're not a research person with these slides, but as we go further into the presentation, there will be less of this. So these are the slides that are particularly hard for me because I have to remember what everybody said. So again, these are studies that have been done on what has PECS, the picture exchange communication system, what do we know about the effect of that system on spoken language or mouth words. So I'm going to start with Preston and Carter. So they found that the effects on speech are unclear, which was similar to Gann's 2012, who found that the effects were low. The mean IRG was particularly low, 0.37 for speech. In general, Gann's 2012 found that collateral effects of PECS, other than specifically teaching the child to produce requests or communication, were lower compared to the benefit that it had for just teaching that functional communication, which was, in all studies, the effects of that are high. White is a more recent review. They don't talk specifically about speech, like I mentioned on the previous slide. They talk more generally about AAC, but they do mention 3 group studies on the effect of PECS on speech, and only one of those 3 studies showed any significant effect on speech. Flippin's results were similar in their review, and so their word they used was questionable effectiveness. They specifically were talking about young children with autism. They also mentioned the difficulty with or the problem that we don't have studies on generalization, or we have very few, one on generalization, one on maintenance, in terms of the effects on speech. But what was really helpful from Flippin's article is that they looked at pre-intervention characteristics that, like I talked about on the previous slide, these make it more likely that if PECS is introduced, that speech will come about. So like on the previous slide, they talk about object exploration as being a predictive variable, and they do list some evidence for that. And they also list echoics. In terms of those, they have some evidence for those. They also mentioned 2 that are more conjecture on their part. One is motor imitation, so the ability to imitate actions other than speech, and the other is joint attention, so that ability to share a focus of interest with another person, that triangle of follow a person's gaze or point towards an object, look back at the person, or initiate joint attention by I point at the learner points at the object, adult looks at the object, learner looks back at the adult. One other factor that Flippin et al. Found to be helpful or predictive was completion of phase 4. And they have some hypotheses about why this might be. Phase 4, for anyone who hasn't used PECS, is where you begin to teach sentence structure. Specifically, you teach I want blank. So I want cookie. And so they think that maybe the reason that kids are more likely to develop speech if you get that far or if you go through phase 4, is that you've been able to get that far. So maybe kids that get that far also have the ability to develop speech, or maybe it's the fact that you're using the time delay. So you're saying, I want, you're waiting, and then after a few seconds, you fill it in with the object name. So while we don't really have great evidence that on its own AAC helps speech come along, there are some things we can do when we're introducing AAC to make it more likely that speech will come along. Of course, there's things we can do outside of AAC as well at the same time, right? So we might be doing some requests with AAC, and at the same time in some other trials or different parts of our session, working more specifically on echoics. And for a great review of that, there's a presentation from Dr. Barb Esch from several years ago at NAC, but it's still very up to date in terms of what's come along since then. There hasn't been many big changes. She does a very good job of reviewing strategies for teaching vocal speech specifically outside of AAC. But with AAC, what we can do is use time delays. So there's been a few studies on that. Tinkani in 2004 and 2006 did studies, Tinkani and et al. Did studies on using time delay along with PECS. They did one where they did that in phase 3 and one when they did it in phase 4. And they had success with that, with improving speech, use of speech. And then Dr. Carbone and his team similarly did it. They did it with sign. They used a time delay with sign. And I'll talk about his procedure for a second because I think it's useful. So they waited 5 seconds. And by the way, Tincani's studies waited 3 to 5 seconds and 4 seconds in the other, just so you get an idea of like the length that you might be waiting during your time delay. I should also probably define time delay, right? So we have some non-behavior analysts in the room. So time delay means waiting before providing a prompt. So I might say cookie, and then the person echoes me, and now, or sorry, so if I was using time delay to teach a vocal word, to teach a mouth word, and I wanted to teach cookie, I'd be holding my cookie up and waiting expectantly for a certain period of time before prompting the child to say cookie. Same thing you can do with AAC. So in these cases, the adult's waiting before modeling a word after the child makes a selection with their AAC device. So what Carbone's team did is wait 5 seconds. If the individual did not produce a vocalization, or if the individual did produce a vocalization of any type, it didn't have to be a specific word, they would provide the object that was requested. If the individual did not say anything during that 5 second period, they would try 3 more times every 2 seconds. And at the end of those 3, they would provide a prompt, right? So after the 5 seconds, the child doesn't say anything, adult says cookie, and then the adult waits 2 seconds, tries saying cookie again, waits another 2 seconds. If after those 3 attempts, the child still did not echo, they would provide them with the object. And one more thing about speech. So parents will often ask, and clinicians wonder this too, will introduction of AAC hinder speech? So Schlosser and Wendt, as well as White et al., they both found that use of AAC did not hinder production of speech. In my own practice, I haven't found that it does, but even though the research is pointing to it not hindering it, I think we do have to keep in mind that anecdotally, some SLPs or BCBAs are finding occasionally that there will be a decrease in speech when we introduce a device in terms of frequency. So it's always good to monitor that, to have a baseline before you introduce the AAC device of the frequency of speech, and to monitor that as speech is as you're working on AAC. And then that doesn't mean if you see a decrease in the frequency of speech that you would stop using AAC. You would just look at some of these variables that we'll be talking about in a minute to determine, what you can do. Right. So a lot of studies have tried to look at comparisons of different forms of AAC to see if in research we're seeing any differences in effects. Lots of studies, or I shouldn't say lots, some studies have looked at sign versus PECs. So one of the variables they looked at or the dependent variables that they looked at is rate of learning. Barlow et al. And Atkins and Axelrod, they both found PECs was learned more readily than sign. Tincani, on the other hand, found that sign was learned more quickly by the individual who, he had 2 participants in this study that I'm talking about. Sign was learned more quickly by the individual who had some imitation skills. PECs was learned more quickly by the individual who did not. And now Gans 2015 states pretty strongly in their article, their review article, that aided language is better overall, so that sign is not as good. But I think the jury is still out. I think it really has to depend on learner characteristics, and I think what Tincani pointed out is really important, that likely motor imitation is a very important variable. If the individual can already imitate, it makes it much easier to teach sign than if they cannot. And another variable I'd probably be looking at is the individual's motor planning skills. So how easily can they imitate more complex actions? You can certainly teach sign even if they cannot. It just becomes harder. What I've found, I haven't done a lot of sign, but recently I did sign with a family where the individual the family really wanted to. The challenge came after we got several signs. This child has difficulty with motor planning, so not just oral motor planning, but limbs. And so even though he could learn to produce a few signs or even several signs in a modified form, because we had to modify them so much, as we got more and more signs, it was harder to differentiate between his various signs. So I think that should be something to consider as well. SGD versus things that are not SGD. So SGD stands for speech generating device. They used to be called VOCAs, voice output communication aids. So these studies were comparing those with devices that don't produce speech, or with the same devices but with the speech with the voice output off. So Sigafus et al. 2023. Sorry, not 2023, 2003. Very different. They used a Big Mac, and it's important to keep that in mind. So that's very different than what many of us are thinking about when we're talking about use of AAC. A Big Mac is one big button that has only one message on it. So they looked at maintenance. So they first taught the individual to make requests with the sound on, with the voice output on, and then turned it off after he had learned. And so they had an on versus off alternating to see if speech was different on it with the sound off versus with the sound on. So like whether the frequency of speech was different, and it was not. So having it on did not suppress speech, but also didn't make speech happen more frequently. Schlosser 2007, this might be a little more similar to the devices we're usually thinking about when we're thinking about voice output versus not. They did their study using a Vantage. So it's a dedicated speech aid that's computer based, and it was dynamic display, meaning if you make a selection, so you've got your bunch of pictures and you select, and you can change pages by making a selection by hitting a linking button. I'll show an example of that in a minute. So they similarly didn't find any effect. So some of their participants did better with the sound on, some did better with the sound off. For some, that made no difference. Bosch et al. They did their study using the Prox Talker. Let me show that for a sec. Has anyone seen one of these? A couple of people. So I don't think they're used anymore. It was interesting. There was a few years shortly after I graduated from my master's in speech, when people were trying all these new things, trying to make text become more, for example, trying to make text have that voice output. So Crosstalker was one attempt at that, but you can see it's quite cumbersome. So you've got the pictures, then you've got the heavy electronic device. And so using that is what, who are we talking about? Sorry, Bosch et al. They did, and again, they did not find a difference in the effects on speech with the sound on versus off for that. Oh, I'm so sorry. You know what? We are talking about, oh yeah, sorry, not the effects of speech, but the effects on the rate at which the individuals learned to produce communication by making a selection. So they did not find a difference with PECs versus the Prox Talker. So PECs with no sound versus Prox Talker with the sound. They did not find a difference. But interestingly, they did talk about that they think that overall, they found social communication improvements were the same with and without voice. So with Prox Talker versus PECs. But they kind of hypothesized that there might be a difference in social communication. I think what they're talking about is the initiation, or the some of you might have seen or noticed that when you're using a voice output device, if you don't purposefully use a strategy that helps the individual know that they need to go get somebody's attention before using it, sometimes you'll see them kind of making requests without getting anybody's attention. And so I think that they probably found that with the Prox Talker, or they were guessing that with the Prox Talker, you'd have less of like going to the person to get their attention. But that probably had to do with like how big the Prox Talker is. You can really do some great things with voice output devices or with SGDs in terms of specifically teaching the individual to gain attention before making requests or before communicating. So another study that looked at PECs versus SGD, Laura et al., they had they used Proloquo as their SGD, so Proloquo on an iPad. They had 3 participants who met criteria faster when using Proloquo. 2 of their participants did not. 2 of their participants met criterion faster with use of PECs. They did find that the overall rate of independent requesting, though, was higher, both during maintenance and during training when they were using the device, when they were using the SGD. And then they also found that 4 of their participants had a preference for the SGD. Kind of similarly, GANs 2015, do we see them yet here? So this is where we're talking more about tablets. GANs 2015, they compared SGDs versus picture-based systems, and they talked about tablet-based SGDs being more effective. Now, they're not talking so much about the individual's performance, they're talking more about logistical things that also make a big difference, in my opinion. So they talk about how these tablet-based systems require less effort to add new words, which is very true. They're even easier, I find, than the older, the dedicated devices. The camera is just quite easy to use and they're light. They also talked about them being lightweight, which is important for portability. They're low cost compared to more dedicated SGDs, and they are better accepted in the community. And then we have Laura et al. Recent study, and in their review, they found participants performed better and also preferred mobile technology, so tablets. Sorry. That the user preferred the Oh yeah, that's a good question. The family versus the user, or the clinical team. Yeah, in this case, we're talking about the user themselves. I was wondering if I missed. I'll just emphasize, I see that there was I think I started talking about the effect on speech, and then I went back to talking about just more general effects. So the last kind of things I was talking about here in terms of use of tablets, this was not in terms of effects on speech, this was more general effects on either, in Laura's study, Laura et al. Study 2021, that was talking about the individual's performance, so learning of the device. And then GANs was talking more about kind of logistical things, but not specifically about the effects on speech. Okay, so now that we have all that in mind, how do we select an aided system? So how do we determine that we want this individual or the family and the clinician think that the individual, or hopefully the individual themselves as well, if possible, want the individual to have an aided system? How do we decide which one? And so there's a few variables that I think are really important to look at. We want it to be something that the individual can use independently, learn to use independently. Obviously, at the beginning, they cannot. But an example of one that is less likely that an individual is going to use independently, no matter how much teaching you do with it, is those mid-tech devices, so like a tech talk, because of the requirement for changing the overlay. So certainly they can learn to use it independently with one overlay being there. But now let's say you have farm animals on your device and they want to talk about food that they want, they have to switch the overlay, and it's very hard just motorically to do that. As I talk about this, I realize I'm speaking about younger children or individuals with some motor difficulties, so I guess someone with higher motor skills could switch their own overlays. We want to be able to maximize the number and the variability of the messages that the individual will be able to produce. Obviously, they won't be able to produce large numbers right away. We want to have the system be something that they can grow into and be able to produce multiple messages. We want it to be portable. I find that that's very important. So, while large devices, like they can carry them, an individual can carry them in a backpack, but that would be kind of like us having to carry our laptop. We'd rather not, right? We'd rather carry our phone. And if we want the individual to, for example, be able to walk around a classroom and make requests, and let's say the individual wants to go play in the sandbox and they have to go request a shovel. If they are carrying a large device at the same time, that would be very hard. So how are they going to carry back the shovel? So having something that's portable and wearable by the individual, if they're willing to wear it, if they're comfortable wearing it, that can be really helpful. I mentioned that we want the vocabulary to be able to grow with them, but on the other hand, we have to balance that with making sure that the device is going to support them in the short term as well. I heard Dr. Andy Bondi at one point talking about we don't want the system to just be a dictionary that the individual carries around. So, we can give them a device that may not fit their needs, but has tons of vocabulary. And sometimes we feel good because we've given them a device with tons of vocabulary, but if it's something that is so complicated that they cannot use it in the short term with a little bit of teaching, it's kind of like just handing them a dictionary without teaching them how to use the dictionary. Um, so for some learners, we would be starting with the arrays being very small. Now we want to move very quickly into them using an array size that we think is going to be the array size that they're going to use for many years. When I say array size, I mean on a particular page of a device, you have various pictures or various icons of some sort. You can vary how many you have. So you can have from 1 to 120 or even more, infinite really. Yes. Yes, that's yeah. So before we start working with the individual, or usually we'll do this after we've done a little bit of teaching, we determine what array size is going to work best for them. But often we can't even do that until we've taught them the meaning of the icons, or the idea that selecting an icon, selecting it in some way, results in outcomes of some sort. So basically we need to teach them that these icons are used for communication. And so that might mean that initially we start off with one picture, just like is done in the picture exchange communication system. We might do that on a device as well. But we want to move, and we would gradually increase the array size. And like I said on the slide, we want to make sure that we're as quickly as possible moving into having them use the same array size and the same setup that they'll be using long term, if we can, because, and this is another area of controversy. You'll hear a lot of SLPs talking about it's all about the motor planning. And that is important. The motor planning is important. The motor planning allows for automaticity. Once an individual doesn't have to be looking for their words all the time, they can quickly make their selections and it can be more automatic. But we're not going to get to automaticity until we've taught discrimination, like you said over there. And so often we do have to start small with a small array size, but we also want to then move quickly into having the array size that we think the individual will use for years to come. So when we're thinking about deciding on which device or which system to use, we want to do feature matching. This is a term that Shane and Costello came up with in 1994. One thing we want to look at is whether the individual is able to use direct access. So can they somehow select pictures by pointing to them, even if they're pointing with a full hand, or do they need to make selections in a different way? So that examples would be like eye gaze, for example, where the individual makes a selection by looking at a particular position on the device. And most individuals, individuals with autism usually are able to make direct selections because they don't also have other motor issues, but some of them do, right? So an individual with a comorbid difficulty, that's where we'd likely be looking at our alternative access. We want to make sure before we make our decision about which device to use, check if the individual can use a dynamic display device. So dynamic display again means you've got your set of pictures on your array, like you might have cat, dog, but you also have a linking button that links to like food, for example. to be most individuals can learn to use these. One skill they need to have is object permanence. So the idea that the understanding that even though I don't see something now, I can get to it. It's still there. And I've rarely had individuals who weren't able to learn to use dynamic display. I had one individual who had difficulty just because of his impulsivity, and there were some behaviors. So he wasn't right away able to learn to use one because he would get very upset if the picture he needed was not immediately there. But as I said, that was one person in my career of, I don't know, since 2007. Um, so most people can use learn dynamic display, and we'll get into why we want dynamic display. Basically, it just allows access to so many more words than you'd be able to otherwise have. If we're considering an electronic system, we'd want to make sure that they're able to activate it. Some individuals early on are not able to activate iPads for whatever reason. It might be that I've watched them and I can't always figure out what it is. It's maybe that they're not providing enough pressure, but even when I try to help them, I don't know. So, but basically we want to test if they're able to activate the system that you're trying to have them activate. We want to know if they're anticipated to need typing, or if their family or they would like to learn to type or to spell on the device, because some systems can support that and some cannot. And we want to know about the size of the system, what size is needed. So we want the system to be as small as possible, like I said, because of portability needs. But in determining that, we have to think about the individual's vision, their fine motor skills. With fine motor, we're looking at specifically, like, can they isolate a finger to make a selection? Because that can allow for that can allow your system in general to be smaller, because each of your buttons can be smaller. And then their need for a mobility aid. So like I said, you know, maybe some individuals with autism will also have comorbid difficulties, and if they require a mobility aid for whatever reason, sometimes that's a consideration, because we want to know if the device can be mounted on their wheelchair if they're using one. And that can sometimes allow us to use a bigger device. So if the individual's in a wheelchair, using a wheelchair, they might be able to have a larger device than we otherwise give them, because when it's mounted, it's not as much of a worry in terms of carrying it. And they might also need it larger, so you know they can see it from their seat and that sort of thing. And then we want to look at the types of symbols that the individual needs. So if they've previously been using symbol sticks, for example, so there's different types of symbols. Dynavox, for example, uses PCS, picture communication symbols, whereas Proloquo, their symbols are called symbol sticks. So if the individual's been using one of these before and has comfort with a particular set, we might want to stick with that set. Although that's likely, like if they're doing well already with symbols, the symbols aren't that different, so it may not be so much of an issue, but it's something to test. And then we think about their behavioral needs. So is the system durable enough? Often we can make it durable by, you know, putting on a good protector, if it's a tablet, for example. And then with tablet-based systems, because a lot of our individuals have experience with having them as tools to play with, we'd have there might, and I haven't encountered this actually, but I could imagine a situation where an individual might be very upset that you're trying to get them to do something other than play with their preferred or engage with their preferred item on that device. So that might be something you have to work on before you can use it for AAC, or consider a different type of system. So this brings us to a major area of controversy in the field. I will say, I think a lot of people don't realize it's a controversy. A lot of people, and I would say this is mostly my SLP colleagues, we see this, I think, less in ABA world. Maybe because of things being said at conferences at for SLPs, I'm not really sure. And now social media, of course. The idea of core versus fringe. So core vocabulary refers to words that we think people use, or words that make up a large proportion of what people say all the time. And they're words that can be used across contexts. I'll talk in a second, or I guess I could do that now, about how these were determined. So how have core words for kids in particular been determined? there's been a couple of studies. One was Buchelman et al. He did it, or that team did it with 4-year-olds. They looked at what group of words do 4-year-olds say most often. And then Banerjee, I think I'm saying the word wrong, Banerjee maybe, did the same sort of study with 2.5-year-olds. And this is the list that Banerjee came up with. So as you can see, it's a lot of words that are not content words. So like prepositions, for example, off and out. And so, like I said, some people argue that those are the words we need to focus on because they're going to make it possible for the individual to communicate in the largest number of contexts. But for many individuals with ASD, fringe, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of many of us, those actually are the core. Those are like fringe words, so content words, often nouns, some verbs, are the things that the individual needs to communicate about most often. So as you saw, some of those words would not really make sense to be first words that we teach. And like I said, these words, for example, they came up with them by looking at what 2.5-year-olds are saying. 2.5-year-olds are already speaking in some sentences. And that's very different than what our early learners are doing when we're first introducing them to AAC. And I'll give you an example if I can get this to turn on. So this was my daughter when she was 2.5. You'll notice that her speech is not so intelligible, like it's hard to understand it, but she is making some pretty nice sentences. Let's see if I can.
Oh, okay. So wait, tell me again. So you went to Daddy's room and then what happened? And then what? Oh, why were you looking for cookies?
I made a poo in the toilet. Sorry about the reference there.
You don't have any more what?
I don't have any more stories to tell you.
Okay, so I'll end storytelling. Thank you.
So I went to Daddy's office. There was no cookie. I'm gonna get a cookie. I get a cookie because I made a poo. Sorry. The 2.5-year-olds are speaking in some grammatical sentences and talking about some, toilet words. But that is quite different, you can imagine, from some of the kids who were starting therapy with. So basing it on what those 2.5-year-olds are saying probably doesn't make the most sense. And just thinking again in terms of like common sense, does it make sense for out, for example, to be an early word? So like I said there, early in teaching, we actually might need nouns and verbs to be much of what we teach, which is what forms much of the early speech of typically developing children in what we would call the first word stage. And that doesn't mean, though, that we never want to teach core. Like, we do want to get to the words, particularly prepositions, for example, that the individual is going to need, or prepositions that they're going to need to use academically, emotion words. We want to get to all of that, but we have to start somewhere, and that often is, or usually would be, starting with nouns and then some verbs, but verbs that they would be motivated by. Motivation is a huge piece here. So again, back to the out, our kids probably don't have a lot of motivation. I mean, unless if they want to go out a door to get something, maybe there we have motivation for out. But the frequency at which they have motivation for a lot of these core words is quite low. I'll give you an interesting example. I had a colleague who was teaching out because it was a core word, so she thought she should teach it. And so she had a bunch of toys that the individual wanted, and she would have them say out to make requests to get the toy, because she would take it out when he would say out. The problem with that is now that toy is likely going to be, if the child is learning this. So, depending on how we teach, the child may or may not learn what we're trying to teach. But if they were going to learn it, I would bet that likely a lot of these toys would now be called an out. And that doesn't really help us in a situation, they come into our clinic and we haven't yet put the toy into any container. We don't know what they want. They say out. What does that mean? Oh, and a really important point is this study by Lobster and Light. If you're in the AAC world, you probably heard of Dr. Light, and I'm so happy that she was part of this study because she's very well known and she is not behavioral. And I thought that was great because I think up to now, or up to her study, I think a lot of people thought, oh, it's just those SLP BCBAs that are saying not to use core. But what they found, I'll read her quote, results suggest that core word lists may underemphasize many of the types of words that predominate in early expressive vocabulary. These lists may not be the most appropriate resources to guide AAC system design and instruction for early symbolic communicators. We can skip that. There we go. So what do we do? I just mentioned core vocabulary and how it's not the thing we should be focusing on, and we should be focusing on content words, so like nouns and verbs. What do we do with that vocabulary that are on, let's say, pre-made pages? Like when you get Proloquo, for example, you can customize it as much as you want, but it also has pre-made pages. Same with most of the systems, Touch, Chat, LAMP. And so what if they already have what if they have some of these non-content words on them? So more function words like prepositions or like the and and the individual's not going to use them. So I've had a lot of people say to me like, oh, don't have them there because they can't use them yet. We don't want to jump right to that. We want to look at, well, we have three choices. We keep the symbols there as is, we keep the symbols on the page, but we hide them, or we remove the symbols. Keeping them on the page and hiding them is nice if that can work, if the individual can manage a large array size, because then erasing them doesn't interfere with motor planning if you're going to put them back in later. It doesn't require you to then have to move buttons later in the future. But you might need to remove them, and we'll talk about when. So the answer depends on a consideration of the number of symbols that the individual can manage on a page. One thing we want to know is how many pictures can the individual manage to scan, so like to be able to look at, how many pictures can be on a page so that the individual is still efficiently being able to scan, so to look at all the pictures and find what they want. And part of the consideration there is also their fine motor skills. So, can they isolate that finger to be able to touch small symbols? We want to think ahead to the future and not delete them or not remove those pictures if we can, but we also need to make sure it's not interfering with their current learning. And those are things that SLPs will look at when they're doing their assessments, the assessments that kind of like insurance covers before they, this is what I've heard from podcasts. I don't work here in the US, but I hear that you guys do assessments and then advise insurance as to which device. Yeah, so SLPs, it's nice. I think that's a nice collaboration. If a BCBA is about to introduce a device, bringing an SLP who's got a lot of experience with doing those sorts of assessments is helpful. So now once we've got our device, how do we want to organize it? The common way to organize it is called a taxonomic organization. Here's sort of an example of it. So most things here are organized taxonomically, so organized according to semantic category or a category of things that go together, like clothes, vehicles, furniture. But as you can see, even when you do taxonomic, there are some things that are more what we call schematic. So schematic means you're organizing your vocabulary like by activities. Dr. Light and her team have been really big in the visual display world, and they talk about an example of schematic being, things to do with a birthday party. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a sec. If you're using schematic, you could have a grid just like the taxonomic systems. Their taxonomic systems are grids. Schematic systems can be too. So you might have a grid that has birthday party and going to McDonald's and going to the doctor, for example. Or they can be a visual scene display. A visual scene display means you take a picture of objects in the situation and people in a situation where they would be found. So if you were teaching the person to talk about hygiene items, you would maybe take a picture of the washroom, and if they wanted soap, you'd be having them select soap within the context of looking at a washroom. Or the birthday party example, they had different rooms. So they had like the entrance, and they had an opening presents scene. So the visual scene would be a picture of opening presents. You have the couch, people sitting on the couch, kids opening a present. But like I said, so if you're using taxonomic, you still have to end up sometimes with like folders that are schematic. So like the TV one, for example, you'll have some TV shows, but you'd also have language that goes with TV, like on and off. And so it's not necessarily only semantic organization. So is there a benefit to visual scene displays versus not using visual scene displays? And I'll say I did my master's thesis on visual scene displays. I'm mostly not a huge, like I haven't seen it have the effect that Dr. Light and her team are hoping that it would have. But this is where this is what the research is showing. So Drager et al. Did a study using children, typically developing children who were 2.5. They all had a lot of trouble learning to navigate. Now they did better with navigation in the visual scene display. So navigation being going from a main menu to going to a particular page where you need to get words. So once they were on the once they had navigated, let's say they were navigating to the opening present scene, once they were there, it didn't matter whether it was visual scene display or grid that they were using, but they did better with navigating when it was a visual scene display. But they themselves argue that it's possible that the navigation was maybe easier because they were using, I think they're called thumbnails. So the button that would get you to the picture of the scene with the kids opening the presents was a picture, a screenshot of that page. So that might have made it easier as opposed to it being a visual scene display that made it easier in some way. And then we have a 2009 study, again, using typically developing kids, neurotypical kids, sorry, 4 and 5-year-olds, and they found no significant difference between 3 different types of dynamic display systems. So visual scene display versus grid schematic versus taxonomic. What has shown, or like where we have seen in the research some benefits for visual scene displays has been with number of turns taken by the individual. And so I've wondered maybe if it might be beneficial in a situation where our goal is sustained interactions, or what we might call joint action routines or social behavior chains. So for example, if we're singing a song with a child and we want them to maybe fill in words by picking, whether we're in Old MacDonald, whether we're going to sing about the pig or the cow, maybe if they've already been watching a YouTube clip of animals, maybe we take a screenshot of that and use that for their selections. It may not improve their accuracy, but it looks like from this study that it'll potentially improve their the number of turns that they'll take in the interaction. So it might be beneficial in that way. And then Light et al. In 2014 talked about using video VSDs, where you play a video. This is really interesting. You play a video and you pause it, and then when it's paused, there are hotspots that the individual can press. And I thought this might actually be interesting for use if we were teaching a social behavior, sorry, not a social behavior chain, if we were teaching a behavior chain, for example, making a sandwich. If you'd be watching the video of what to do, and then now we're ready so the individual has learned to do it, and now we're ready to do chain interruption. So that means we've got the materials ready to make the sandwich, or they start making the sandwich, but we have something missing. In the interrupted chain procedure, you have something missing, so that the individual needs to make a request. Or, well, yeah, I think it's always a request. And so they need the bread. So you've got your video, and maybe the bread and the video is now a hotspot. They press it and they get the bread. Or bread's usually the first thing. So maybe it's like the mustard is missing, and they select mustard and get the mustard. I worried there. I have a question mark. I wonder how that would affect generalization, but probably it would be okay. We would do that, and then we would fade out the video and have them make the request for mustard in the usual mustard, like the usual folder where you'd find mustard. So some interesting ideas for how we maybe could use VSDs, but generally, are VSDs going to be better for teaching our early learners? Probably not. Um, so our variables to consider when deciding how to organize our system. We want to maximize the number of vocabulary available, but also we want to select a grid size that contributes to efficient learning, which sometimes might mean the grid size has to be kind of small. And at the same time, we want to minimize the number of keystrokes that are required to select vocabulary. Keystrokes are what you have to press to get to your, like, let's say you want juice. You might have to first press food, like from your homepage, you press food and then you press drinks and then you get juice. So that's 3 keystrokes. Might be easier if you just have to go food and then juice. The larger number of the more words you can have per page, the less keystrokes needed because the less linking buttons you have to press to get to where you're ultimately going. So that's another consideration when deciding how to set it up. And as you can see, some of these things kind of conflict with each other. So it can be very hard, and often it requires a lot of tweaking as you go with the individual once you've set up the system. Okay, so now we've got our system set up. How do we teach it? Another area of controversy. Do we use augmented input where we have no expectation for what the learner is going to do, where we're doing a lot of modeling? So we're modeling without expectation. Is that what we should do? Or direct teaching, where we expect some sort of prompt, we expect some sort of response from the learner that we will prompt in some way initially. And obviously we want to fade those prompts. So which is better? And this is obvious, this is a big area of controversy. Often with SLPs being the ones saying we want to be using more augmented input. You might have heard the word aided language stimulation. Until very recently, I thought I was using that word a lot, but it turns out that's actually like one type of augmented input. So in the literature, when you're searching it, better to look for augmented input. So what do we find generally? And why are people saying that augmented input is supported by the literature? Well, when you look generally, like when if you quickly look at the abstracts for these studies, generally their effectiveness is good, but we need to look deeper than that for our specific population. So Chazen et al. Did a really great deep dive into this. And I imagine a lot of you who've been working in AAC for a while and have tried augmented input or seen people using, you probably had a lot of these like thoughts already. So I think that this study kind of confirmed for us what we knew. So when we're looking at the studies that have had good effects, that have shown positive effects for augmented input, why can't we just rely on that? Well, first, intervention of efficacy was moderated by the following items: receptive language skills. So people who did well, who did better in these studies had higher receptive language skills. I believe, I'm trying to remember, there was an age. I think it was like if you had above a 2-year-old level of receptive language, that's when you did better in these studies. Age, so there's been some studies showing adults don't do as well. And then diagnoses, so individuals who had only a speech and language deficit, they did much better than individuals who also had autism, for example. That's our population. And then there's the idea that, or the fact that most of the studies did not use only augmented input. Augmented input was a component in a package. So the packages often included systematic prompting, which is not augmented input, and they included reinforcement. So the individual would make a request and get the item they wanted. It's important to keep this in mind because a lot of people who want to use augmented input are trying to use augmented input alone or as like a major piece of what they're doing, when in the studies that are showing the efficacy, it was a component of a larger package. And then some other factors that make those studies that show effectiveness not so reliable. One is publication bias. So Chazen et al. Actually found that in non-peer-reviewed literature, for example, like theses, dissertations, um, they were half as likely to show a positive effect as compared with those that were being published. So it kind of looks like people are more likely to get their study published if they do have positive results with augmented input. And so we're kind of selecting out studies that are not showing that positive effect. So we're not going to see those studies. And then the other difference, or the other problem with a lot of the studies, is that often it was a static display. And so that's very different than trying to teach an individual to use a dynamic display. O'Neill, Light, and Pope found similar results to what later Chazen found. Theirs was a meta-analysis. Similarly to what was previously said, they also found that most studies were a multi-component intervention, so not just augmented input when they did show positive results. They also had concerns about the quality of the studies. And yeah, like I said, so the ones that had large effect sizes, they often were multi-component interventions, whereas those that had smaller effect sizes were those that only included augmented input. Oh, and often the positive results they were seeing were related to pragmatics, so like the number of turns taken, as opposed to looking at the individual's accuracy with making selections. Both are important. We want the individual to be able to participate in sustained social interactions, but we also want them to be able to, express what they really want to say. So their quote is, I think, really important. They say it is possible that interventions using aided graphic symbols may not be developmentally appropriate for individuals at the earliest stages of communication development. And unfortunately, that's often where they're being used. So probably need to be looking at that. In terms of time, oh, I guess we're still okay. We'll take a break if that's okay around like 2:45. Does that work for everybody? So this doesn't mean though that we should never use augmented input, and maybe there are some people who would benefit from it. So for whom might they be appropriate? And some of these are my guesses. I mean, we saw the receptive language piece being something that one of the other authors referred to. Oh, it looks like I was right with my memory. It was if the individual already has comprehension at the level of a 2-year-old. And then we also want to, I would guess that they're going to do better if they already have good attending skills. So they're already watching what adults are doing or what other people are doing. They already have motor imitation skills, and imitation more generally. So it actually is not enough to have good just motor imitation skills. So if the individual is good at, I clap, you clap, I touch my head, you touch your head, that doesn't really tell us they're going to do well with augmented input, because if you think about what you have to do to copy someone's use, like let's say mom taps on dog, you have to be able to do multi-step imitation, so to with discrimination there, right? So on the first page you have to first select animals, and then you have to look for what mom found dog. Much harder than just copying someone clapping. Plus I wrote observational learning skills, because that refers to more like being able to see what someone did and then do it again in the right context. So not just observe what they did and copy it right away, but wait until later when you actually need to do the same thing. So mom talks about dog, this morning when he comes in the kitchen, and then later you want to go get the dog and he's at grandma's and you want to say dog. So now you have to say, oh, well, when mom was talking about a dog, she went to this page. No, I'm going to do the same thing now. That's very hard. What I talked about was, watching mom label it. Now you're requesting, but same thing, even if it was requesting. So mom wants, what does she want? Mom wants juice, or mom knows you want juice. She selects juice. Later on, I'm thirsty, I want juice. I have to realize I should select the same thing mom did before. Very hard. And so instead of aided or for those very early learners, who are not going to benefit from augmented input, I think what we should be doing, and it looks like the research is showing us what we should be doing, is more direct teaching. So if we're going to do direct teaching, how do we do it? The general teaching procedure. So we want to teach some sort of selection response. So if it's with an SGD, like a computer-based SGD or a tablet-based SGD, we want to teach them what when they tap on the symbol, they get the thing that the symbol is saying. Or if it's picture exchange, we want to teach them that they're going to pick up the picture and give it to someone. And that results in getting a desired object. So we do that with a single picture. And then we want to gradually increase the field of icons. So now they've learned that these pictures in some way get them things they want. These pictures have meaning. Now we gradually increase the array of icons available. And I'm going to go through Laura et al.'s study because they did a really great job of talking about how to do that. And then we also need to teach navigation. So once we've taught them how to scan an array, how to look at an array to find the picture they want or the icon they want, we also need to teach them how to get from a home page to the page that contains their symbol. So a big piece of teaching is what is called in milieu teaching environmental arrangement. As ABA practitioners, we would probably say contriving motivations or setting up the environment to contrive motivation. Ways to do this, we can present choices. So we hold up objects and say, which one, or we hold it up and don't say anything. We just wait for them to make a choice. We can use an interrupted chain procedure. So that was that example I gave before of we're having them make a sandwich and part of the sandwich they need is either like missing, you don't see it at all, or we're holding it so they have to request it when it's in sight. For a younger child, that might be more like they're coloring, but they use the blue marker, but now the green marker that they need next is missing. We set up an activity where they need assistance. So, we give them objects that they can't open, containers that they can't open that have things inside that they want, for example. And then when we know that the child, like the parent is anticipating what the child needs, and often we'll make her help the child get the thing that they need, but instead we want to be waiting. We notice the child needs something, we wait for them to make some sort of request. And this brings me to talking about the picture exchange communication system, another area of controversy. The picture exchange communication system to date is really the only manualized system. I did see one other manual, and it was for teaching individuals to request using like object symbols, but this is the best well-known manualized one. And you'll hear a lot of people saying, don't use PECS. PECS is very limiting. PECS only teaches you to request. And our kids or our individuals deserve more. Totally agree with the last part. Our individuals deserve the world. They deserve us to be giving them the communication skills that they need to have high quality of life. But one, we have to start somewhere. So what we have to date in our literature is really great data showing that we're really good at teaching requesting. We don't really have data showing that we're so great at teaching other things. And I think our field should still, continue to work on that. But that doesn't mean that we need to, be throwing the kitchen sink at people and not, avoiding using something like PECS. Also remembering that when we're using PECS, we're specifically using pictures to request, but we can also be adapting that system to use with SGDs. So it doesn't mean if you're doing PECS, maybe if you're calling it PECS, you should be using the pictures, but if you're using that system that you have to be sticking with just pictures. And a really important thing to remember is our literature has a lot of great articles, a lot of great studies showing the effectiveness of PECS. So it's not something that, we should be throwing out, in my opinion. So all of these studies have shown, these are systematic reviews and meta-analyses, all showing that PECS has been successful in teaching individuals to communicate, specifically to make requests. Oh, and then it says among other benefits, and that's because in addition to showing that use of PECS results in the individual being able to make requests and communicate, it also, there's been kind of collateral benefits found, like improvements in problem behavior, improvements in social communication, etc. And as we talked about before, some minimal, modest improvements in speech, maybe for some people. So what is PECS? It has these 6 phases. So we start with how to communicate. So that's where the individual is taught to pick up a picture and exchange it with only one picture in front of them. And then it teaches distance and persistence. So picking up a picture and taking it to someone who's not right there, as well as finding there's usually a binder of pictures that you're using called a communication book. So also like finding that communication book if it's not immediately in front of you. And that's often really important, because when we find that kids or people are not initiating, often it's that thing is not there. The communication book is not there. They don't do that initial step of trying to get it. Behaviorally, we can say that communication book being in front of them is currently functioning as an SD. So we need to transfer that stimulus control. Phase 3 is when we start to have more than one picture there, and we're starting to teach you have to pick the right picture to get the thing that you want. But then we move to sentence structure, and that's where in PECS they do I want blank. I will tell you, I don't do that step anymore. A lot of people still do. It's still very much part of the system. I just don't, because reading things, from Dr. Carbone, and also parent preferences often it doesn't align with it. How Dr. Carbone talks about the importance of using verb object or attribute object as opposed to those carrier phrases, because of the, I want, for example, doesn't have a lot of meaning. And I found when you start with I want, often I want gets put in front of other things. When you're with individuals being asked to label, what is this? I want banana, when it should be, it's a banana or just banana. And at the same time that you're now moving on to, you can either be moving on to phase 5, or usually you're doing it at the same time. You're moving on to phase 5 where you're teaching responsive requesting. So you say, what do you want? And the individual responds with, I want blank. At the same time, you also start teaching attributes. So like big cookie, little cookie, or colors. So like red juice, yellow juice, red candy, yellow candy. And then they move on to commenting, where in impacts, you teach the individual to say, I see blank. So I'm going to talk about, those spaces I talked about there are specifically for PECS when we're teaching an individual to pick up a picture and exchange it. And now I'm going to talk about using that with an SGD. And this is generally what I do, with some details kind of left off. Then we're going to go through it again with what Laura et al. Did in their study, so that you have an idea of what has been shown to work in research. And also Laura adds just some really, Laura et al. Adds some really useful details. So we start with a preference assessment. So it can be having the parents fill out a questionnaire, and then either an informal preference assessment that the clinician does themselves, or a more formal one. And then we also want to make sure we're doing momentary preference assessment. So right in the moment when you're about to have the individual make a request, you want to make sure that the objects you have available for them are objects that they currently want. And sometimes you don't really need to do that because they're already showing you. They've already initiated letting you know what they want by like pointing to it or leading you to it. And then we start by, we have for example, on Proloquo or on Touch Chat, I'll set up a page where the whole page is one picture. I might also do it where that picture there's only one picture on the page, but the picture may not take up this whole screen. And that'll vary depending on can the child isolate a finger, or how big does that picture have to be? I might also start with the picture taking up the whole screen and then make it smaller and smaller, so that and eventually they have to kind of find that picture on the screen. And then I start to introduce discrimination. So I have 2 pictures, and at this point I'm not using the pictures necessarily that are going to end up on the same page. So while eventually I want to have a page of food where all the foods are, likely when I'm doing 2 picture discrimination, I don't want the two things to be foods, because that can make it harder to learn. So I set up specific pages that I call like my training set. So we start with a picture of a preferred and a non-preferred. And this is another thing, right? Like, so if I was on the food page, probably all the foods are preferred, or at least they're all foods, but like, how am I going to have something like a sock? So I set up a page that has a sock for example, and then a preferred item. And then we move on to more advanced discrimination pictures, where we're gradually going from 2 pictures of preferred to 3 to 4 to 5 on the same page. And these are all pictures of things that the individual has wanted, and they're all preferred. And then I start to teach navigation. Sometimes I'll do navigation where I've contrived it, like I've made my, a training set where, there's like a preferred category versus a category that takes you to like nothing or to neutral stuff. But often at this point, they're already ready to use full pages that you've designed and to really navigate from your homepage, maybe just with some pictures hidden so that the array size is smaller. Just back to here for us. Well, I'll let Laura et al. Talk to us about how to select that item that we use as the neutral non-preferred. An important point to talk about though is we don't want to be using, when I say a non-preferred item, we don't want to be using something the individual is scared of or hates. It's just something neutral so that they have motivation, or so it's easier to make the selection of the button that represents the preferred thing. Once we've taught navigation, then we do what text would call phase 2, where we teach the individual to pick up the device and go to somebody with it to produce their message. They pick it up, go to the individual, and then type the message window. And then at that stage, we're also ready to start introducing more advanced vocabulary like verbs and adjectives. And it's important at that stage that we're doing this based upon preferred items. So we are teaching colors, for example, by setting up a situation where the individual wants one set of, a bubbles bottle that's purple because they know there's bubbles inside versus the green bubbles container that's empty. Or I often will use matching activities for this. So we have various pictures of birds and they all look the same, but they differ in color. So now I've already given them the yellow bird. Now they need the green bird. So there's a reason that they need to select to say green. And then we can also teach multi-word utterances. So that would be red bird, for example. And I'll get into how to do that in a bit. So here's what Laura et al. Did. So they specifically, for their preference assessment, they use multi-stimulus without replacement as their formal preference assessment. And then they also do what I called a momentary preference assessment. They call it an in vivo preference assessment. From their preference assessment, their initial one, that's how they select their neutral objects. So they use things that either the individual never selected or that ranks the lowest as their neutral object. They start with a baseline, and that's where they just hold up objects and like allow the individual to select to see if they're going to select the thing that matches what they want, what they reach for. In phase 1, they are like I talked about before, have a single picture on the screen. Now they do not, Laura et al. Did not use any sort of physical prompting. Their only prompt was the fact that, there's only one picture, for example. And the individual still did well. So that's an interesting thing, because in PACS and the way I usually do it, I mean, unless I have someone who happens to start tapping before I help them, it's usually with some sort of physical prompt or gestural prompt, but they didn't do any of that. This is where they introduce discrimination. Now they go right in with picture versus blank. In PECs, we're taught to do that only if the individual has difficulty with picture versus picture, like preferred versus neutral. And then they start doing more advanced discrimination where they have 2 preferred and 1 neutral. And now they call this refining discrimination. 1 picture desired that's the picture of the desired item, 1 that represents another preferred item, so not neutral, and then 1 that's blank. Oh, sorry, I think I said before that these were 2, in addition to the preferred on this page and the neutral, that there were more neutral. So it's 1 preferred, 1 neutral, 2 blanks in phase 3. Oh, an important thing that I don't think I've discussed yet is how do we know that the individual is really selecting what they want? So we can do correspondence checks. So where we have them make a selection from their array, and we're also, let's say they have 3 objects on the array, we're also holding 3 objects. I find it can be kind of hard to do that. I will do it often. I mean, every so often, but more regularly, they've already kind of shown me what they want. Like they've gone and gotten something. So now I know that they, want the bubbles. And so we're working I know that after they make their selection, they really have selected what they want. And I also know I'll also obviously watch to see whether they're like happy with their response. If they select bubbles and I blow bubbles and they're happy with it. But yeah, I will periodically put in a correspondence check after the request where you say, you're holding up your three objects. They've made a selection, so they select bubbles. You're now holding up your three objects, which are like bubbles, banana, and cookie, and you say, take it. If they take the bubbles, that they what they selected was correct. I probably shouldn't have used bubbles though as the example, because with bubbles, they're unlikely to take it because they're used to you as the adult blowing it. So it'd be more like they have their stuffy, and they have a spinning top that they know how to spin themselves, and one other toy. They select spinning top. You say take it, and they take the spinning top. So they found, oh, sorry, as their criteria, Laura et al. Have 80% accuracy and independence across 2 consecutive sessions. And another area of controversy, but maybe before we go into this would be a good time for a break. Does that sound okay? How long would the break be? Like 15 minutes? Okay, so if people come back like a couple minutes just before 3, right? Hi, everybody. Welcome back from break. We're about to start talking about yet another controversy in the area of AAC. I think we better start because so we don't end up running out of time. Might still end up running out of time anyway. I'm really notorious for that with presentations, but trying not to. So prompting. So on social media, I see a lot of people talking about don't prompt. With AAC, you should not prompt. And their fear often is, let's define prompt. So a prompt is any sort of stimulus that meets 2 criteria. So it makes the behavior you're trying to get happen be more likely to happen than it would without the prompt. Basically, you're helping the individual, and you're adding something to what we would call in behavioral terms the 3 or 4 term contingency that wouldn't naturally be there. So in more non-behavioral terms, you're adding a stimulus that would not be naturally there in the natural environment. So for example, if you're saying cookie and your child says cookie, and that's when you give them a cookie, normally when the child wants the cookie, there's not going to be someone first saying cookie before. That's an example. So you're adding something. Or behaviorally, usually we have antecedent, behavior, consequence, or the 4-term contingency, we consider motivation there. So motivation, antecedent, consequence. And here we're adding some stimulus to that. And there's 2 kinds of prompts. I'll go into that in a second. Let me first talk about the controversy. So you'll see lots of people saying, don't prompt with AAC because, well, one, you're kind of violating their independence, or you're making them say something other than what they want to say. And you'll also hear people saying, don't do prompts because the individual will become prompt dependent. So I think when people are saying that, they're not, well, one, they're not realizing that we have great ways of fading prompts. They're not realizing that you can do great prompting while still allowing the individual to initiate. And in fact, you really should. So, you wait for the individual to reach for an apple or point to an apple before you prompt them to select apple. And so you are definitely helping them to tell you what they're trying to say. They've already told you, you're just giving them a different way to say it. I also suspect that when people are talking about prompt dependency, one, they haven't done the right things to fade prompts, but also likely they're trying to have the individual engage in some sort of task that's above their level, above their zone of proximal development. And so they're not learning to do it on their own because it's not something that is right now within the repertoire for something they can do. So assuming we're going to be doing some prompting, here are some information about how to prompt. So 2 types of prompts. A stimulus prompt is something you do to some change you make in the stimuli to make the behavior more likely. An example might be if you on an SGD, if you have two symbols and you want the individual to discriminate between them, and you gradually make, so initially you have one of them maybe be blank and the other one has a picture representing a preferred item. You gradually maybe make the blank one, first it gets a little darker, and then it starts to have part of the picture, and then you gradually make it become more and more similar to the other picture, so that that prompt of it initially being blank is removed that way. And then response prompt, that would be when you're doing something, you're not changing the stimuli, but you're showing the individual the right response, either by giving them a physical prompt, so moving their hand to the right place to make a selection, or a gestural prompt where if it's with an SGD, you're pointing to a button and that's the button that they select. So in my first example of stimulus prompt, when I had that blank picture versus the picture representing the preferred item, that difference serves as the prompt. So yeah, I talked about the current controversy. Prompting is effective and appropriate for AAC, I say, just like it is for any other skill that we teach. So what prompts do we need? So if we're trying to teach that initial skill of learn to make a selection in order to make your request. So if it was a picture exchange, we might physically prompt the individual to pick up the picture and exchange it. We could try gestural prompts first. We probably should. We want to be touching people and moving their arms if we don't have to. But if that doesn't work right away, we go to a physical prompt most likely. And we're also at the same time providing, if we're doing a picture exchange, opening our hand so that the individual, that eventually will become the prompt instead of the physical prompt. And then we fade that open hand. And when we're doing discrimination phases, in those phases, there's kind of two ways that people provide prompts. One might be that they immediately gesturally prompt to the correct picture. So the person, for example, wants apple. So you touch apple right away, or you point to it and then they select it. Or you allow them to make their selection and they either get it right or wrong. If they get it wrong, then at that point you provide your prompt, usually through a gestural prompt. By that point, you'd be unlikely to be doing a physical prompt, although sometimes you try your gestural prompt and it doesn't work, and you realize it's because they're not quite following with such a large array size. Maybe they're having difficulty following your finger. So at that point, you might do a physical prompt for 1 or 2 trials and then fade back. So far we've been talking about using using AAC to make requests for specific objects. But we also want our individuals to be able to participate in what we call in sustained interactions. So not just requesting cookies, or like Dr. Janice Light, who I just remembered is from Pennsylvania. She has a chapter in one of her early books. Oh, I don't know if it's one of her early books, but a book that I read early on in my career called There's More to Life Than Cookies, I believe. And she talks there about the importance of, she calls it social closeness. So activities that lead to social closeness. Examples of that would be like singing a song together. And so we can talk about how to use AAC within those routines. And just to translate for the behavior analysts in the room, a sensory social routine might also be called a social behavior chain. So these are partner-focused joint activities, according to Rogers and Dawson. They're games where the adult acts as the toy. So that's generally done without toys, although I'll give some examples of situations where you might do it with a toy. And they're designed, again, to be things that last more than just, I give you a cookie, you go away and eat the cookie. Instead, we're doing back and forth exchanges with each other for social closeness development. In Hannon, which comes from Toronto, where I'm from, they call these people games as well. They call them people games because the person is acting as the toy, and therefore you don't have to have the child moving back between you and the toy, which can be really hard. You're the focus. Why do we do them? It draws the child's attention towards the adult. provides opportunities to practice communicating for the purpose of social interaction. We can also use them at times because they alter arousal level. So if a child is really tired, getting them up and doing these physical play activities can help to wake them up, or the opposite, if they're having difficulty focusing, these physical play activities can sometimes kind of change the mood. And why do we use AAC within these activities? It's an opportunity to use language outside of just for the purpose of requesting objects. So in addition, because of that, it allows us to have them build their vocabulary beyond nouns. Often this can be where we teach verbs. Types of activities. So routines in which the adults provide preferred movement. So that could be like bouncing a child on your lap. Routines in which the child provides a preferred sensation. That could be where you're like tickling the child or squeezing them. A lot of our kids like deep pressure, so like squeezing head, squeezing feet. Songs with actions. I would say these songs work for a smaller proportion of people than the other two. And so often to get kids interested in the songs, building in the movement into the song can be helpful, or building in the preferred sensation into the song can be helpful. Just to give an example of that, the building in the movement. So they might not love if you're singing Old MacDonald had a farm, but if you're bouncing while you're singing it and then you pause every so often, they're likely to engage with you, especially during that pause, because they want the bouncing to continue. Or Five Little Monkeys jumping on the bed. It's fun because you're also helping them to jump while you're singing the song together, so they want it to continue. The reason it says joint attention at the top is because people have talked about, and particularly, I hope I don't forget her name, Francesca Dudley de Espinoza. He has some great talks on how sensory social routines can be used to build joint attention. I think actually Tamara Casper, who's in the room, talked about this in her presentation yesterday. I missed it, unfortunately, but I believe she talks about that. So that's why it says joint attention. So how do we do these? How do we do these sensory social routines? We start with a preference assessment, find out what kind of movements or sensations we can build into them that they would likely enjoy. We introduce the activity, and initially we have no expectations of the child. We're just showing them, like, within this activity, really fun stuff comes. So we're just bouncing them up and down, and then, I don't know if anyone's done the Humpty Dumpty, so you're bouncing them on your lap and you're showing them that at the end of the song, or each time you say those particular words in the song, you're going to help them to go upside down between your legs. You're just giving all that fun for free the first few times until they're engaged. And then you begin to stop and wait at particular times within this routine. So this is our interrupted chain procedure I talked about before. And your expectations for what they're going to do start very low. So initially, maybe you just want them to, like, kind of look back at you when you stop. That would be enough. Or, and you'll accept anything. There may be a look or a tiny vocalization, anything. And then you keep going. And then you gradually increase your expectation to maybe now they're doing more indicating responses, like they're reaching for you to continue. Or they're perhaps if it's a child that for whom speech comes quickly and easily, we start to expect perhaps a word or a sound. Gradually increase the expectation. And being face-to-face is important during these activities because we want them to both start to see our facial expression as being something that's associated with the activity and associated with the positiveness of the activity, and so that they can learn the cues that are involved in the social interaction. One thing we want to do when we're doing these activities is leave materials that they need for them around, if possible. Like, if there is a material associated with it, I know I mentioned it's usually you being the toy, but you might be using a parachute that you swing them in, or a parachute that you kind of flap up and down that they enjoy. So you leave that in the room and they bring it to you. That's their initiation. So that way they get to initiate the activity and then also practice keeping the interaction going once it has started. And other, in addition to the parachute idea, we can also use kind of people toys. So these are toys that need the adult to activate them, and that way the activity can keep going, because after a wind-up toy, you activate it, it does its thing, and then it stops. Child needs you again. So here is an example for jumping on the bed, no more monkeys jumping on the bed. Initially, we just expect the child to remain in close proximity to the adult, that's all. Or maybe not even that. We might even have an earlier step where we're singing it and maybe we're jumping and they're kind of looking at us every so often. And then we want the child to start engaging in some sort of communicative exchange once they've learned to stay with us. If they can imitate an action, that might be where we do that. Else? If they can imitate a word or a song, we might do it there. But maybe also we're just expecting them to, they might not be ready to say words yet or to imitate sounds or even use AAC yet. Maybe we're just expecting them to like, in Five Little Monkeys, we put our hands down and they pull our hands to request that we continue. And then we start to increase the frequency at which we expect them to provide some sort of response, and we increase the difficulty level of it. After a couple of weeks, for example, the child may have begun imitating speech or maybe using AAC because you've been working with them. So maybe now you start to put in an expectation on using an AAC device or using a word. And this, as I said, could be a place where we do verbs, for example. So maybe, you're helping them jump, you pause and they say jump as a request to continue. Although most likely I'd be working on like the name of the song as the request for continuation. Or, well, no, usually what I do specifically with this song is have them fill in a word in it. If it was with AAC, I'm trying to think of what I might do. Maybe they're pressing a button that says no more monkeys jumping on the bed, or maybe they're pressing jump. Later on, like once we've been doing it for a while and their AAC skills are good, I actually might start having them fill in the correct word. And interestingly, that might be a place where I would maybe a visual scene display could work for that. Here's an example of a sensory social routine. It does not use AAC in this one because it's my daughter who does produce vocal speech. I hope it's not too loud now. Uh-oh, I forgot. How do I activate? There. Oh no. Oh. Sorry, I just realized I oh wait, no, I embedded the other one on top. Oh my. Okay, I can't fix that right now. Sorry. So what basically it's, I'm having her bounce Five Little Monkeys jumping on the bed, and then I stop and I look at her expectantly. Or oh no, I'd say Five Little Monkeys jumping on that. And I look at her expectantly at the end of that line and she says bed, and we keep going like that. Sorry about that. Okay, so the next video, oh no, why is it embedded on all of them? Oh, no, it's not. It's just that it's showing it twice. That's odd. Sorry. So I'll explain this one and hopefully it'll still make sense with maybe if you watch the little one, the little screen. So this is an example also of a sustained social interaction where we're using AAC. We're actually using both AAC and motor speech. And so I'm pausing at particular times. I'm pausing at certain times and expecting motor use of vocal speech at times when the child's able to produce it, and at times when he's not able to produce it. Because of the motor speech constraints at those times, I am not using the expecting vocal speech. I'm using AAC instead. That's right. That's two. And now we can turn the pit. Yeah, this is usually not very hard and it sends me up. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Opposed? Going.
I'll mention one other thing about that. If you notice at the end, he got to have his train, or I think he wanted the boat. But the reason I have that at the end is to create what we would call an ABA, a transitive MO, or another way to explain it, I guess, is it would create a situation where he wants to get to the end of it because of the toy. Now, actually, this little guy might have even done it without that toy at the end because he did seem pretty engaged. But a lot of kids will need that. So you get, you do your book or you do whatever your social, maybe your song, and they may not love the song initially, but they know once you complete it, you get something fun. And because you've done that, now you do that a few times, they start to actually like the song itself, then you may not need to use that reward at the end. Okay, so moving away from requesting, moving to labeling. As I said, our literature talks mostly or almost exclusively when it shows positive results, it's happening with requesting to date. Hopefully we can have some improvements there. But we do also want our individuals, once they can make requests, but requests, are very important to start with, both because they work really well as a starting place, but also because they allow the individual to contact reinforcement or to get access to things that they want. And that's how we improve quality of life initially. But then to make quality of life as good as possible, we also want to, if we can, give them the opportunity to label things, to make comments, and to engage in behaviorally what we would call intraverbal, or more generally what we would call, or in speech pathology, what we might call answering questions, responding to comments. So taking turns in an interaction using both obligatory turns and non-obligatory, like response to comments. And as well as the other thing we would want them to be able to do as well is to be able to ask their own questions. So starting with tacts. So we have two different kinds of tacts or labels that we want to teach. One would be like when we say, what is this? And that's important because at school, that's often a task that needs to happen. And also that allows us later to be able to teach more advanced things. So if the individual can answer, what is this? Then later we can teach them to answer, like, what do you see? When the answer is, the boy is jumping. And then it would also be great if we can teach spontaneous commenting. Now I found this tends to work better if the individual already is engaging in non-vocal means of trying to spontaneously comment. So they're already like bringing you objects to show you, or they're pointing to things. If they don't have that, they're not initiating joint attention without symbols yet, trying to get them to do it can be very hard. And sometimes you have to wonder if it's right for the individual to be pushing them to do it. But I think it does make sense to try to teach it so that once they engage in that initiation of joint attention and they get to see the result, which is the positive response from another person, perhaps they'll get to like it. And so, now you've given them a skill that enriches their life. So that's how I think about it in terms of, when I'm trying to decide on, like, do I want to kind of push joint attention on someone that's not showing it in a conventional way? So how do we create opportunities for spontaneous commenting? We want to create situations that are out of the ordinary. So I'll put stickers on cups, or things in places that they don't belong, so that there's like they have that, ooh, there's something interesting here. And then it can also help to create situations where there's a clear SD, a clear discriminative stimulus. So a clear situation that says, hey, you should now show somebody something. So I've done that by doing activities that are completed, like task completion activities, arts and crafts, for example. They learn that when the arts and crafts activity is complete, they go and show it to somebody. So the completion of the activity acts as the cue to go show it to somebody. What else have I done that with? It really has mostly been or completion of, like, if they don't like art, completion of a puzzle, completion of something that they enjoy doing. And then making sure initially that either the individual, the parent's response or your response is like very excited. And if the parent's excitement and your excitement is not enough, initially pairing it with some sort of object. So they come and show the parent says, yay, and also blows bubbles, or they come and show the parent And they also like, give an edible, if there's nothing else at that moment that's reinforcing. In general, I would avoid edibles, but there's times when edibles are foods that people eat, preferred foods. There's times when those tend to work the best, but best to avoid them if we can. Uh, oh, and then we would add, so initially they'd, be getting up and showing their art activity to the parent. And then we gradually increase the demand. So eventually they maybe come and show it and they say, look, to try to get the parent to look at them. So they press look on the device. Or they might, be taught to say the name of the object that they're showing. So intraverbals, again, this is responding to questions, responding to comments. So it's responding to something that someone else has, usually that they've said, by saying something different. So, a echoic would be I say banana, you say banana, but an intraverbal, you say something different than what I've said. I say, what's your favorite food? And you say banana. No, intraverbals, I think throughout our field, not just AAC and AAC, throughout our field, I think they've been very hard to teach and remain hard to teach. Early ones aren't as hard, so fun fill in. So we do things like ready, set, and the individual fills in go. We can do the same thing with an AAC device. And if, when we're doing that, we would teach it the same way that we teach requests for objects. So we'd already have the page open as opposed to teaching them to, navigate. And then once they learn to select it, then we teach them to also navigate to the page after we say ready, set, or filling in words in songs. Those tend to be a bit easier to teach. And then RFFC, so that refers to receptive by function feature class. So we put out a bunch of pictures in front of the child. Maybe we show a dog and a bike and a t-shirt, and we say, which one says woof? And which one do you ride? And once they can make that selection without having to say anything, then we can place the demand of also, we ask a question, and we teach them to respond with, what do you ride? The answer is bike. A note on doing this. So, we talked before about how to set up the device, the organization. I've seen sometimes on ABA teams that people are setting it up so the device they're organizing with like requests, intraverbals, tacts. So mands, intraverbals, tacts, which corresponds in speech pathology terms to requests, responses to questions, and labels. We don't want to be doing that because we want the individual, like, a banana is a banana, whether you're using it to answer a question or whether you're asking for it. And the individuals we're working with, they have, they haven't studied verbal operands or functions of communication like we have. And so it wouldn't make sense to them to have these in those, to have that sort of organization. So yeah, just a note on that. And the way we would teach IFFC, interval by function feature class, would be the same thing that we do with individuals who use vocal speech. So we'd be holding up the object, asking the question, showing a picture, which is the answer. So, what do you eat? We show a picture of banana, they say banana, and then we might run a transfer trial. So we say, what do you eat? And they select banana again. Usually by the time we're doing this, they're very good at navigating, so we don't have to worry about, opening the page and doing backwards chaining to get them to select the right picture. They've got that skill already. So we're starting with them on the home page, asking a question, and they go to the right page to make the selection and answer the question. How do we teach kids to answer questions about past events? That's a really important intraverbal skill. So Dr. Judah Axe has been doing a lot of work on this, and I know he spoke yesterday. This skill is itself a problem-solving skill. It's not a rote skill. Like, what did you eat today? It's going to differ every day, as opposed to like, what do you ride? The answer might always be bike. But these are more difficult because they change across, moment to moment. So one strategy that Dr. Axe and his team has talked about is making sure that you're prompting within the situation that you're going to be asking about later. So you're at a birthday party and maybe you're labeling, we're at a birthday party, or while you're at the birthday party, while the child's eating cake, you say cake. Or at this point, the child probably has, better language than that. So you can explain like, you're eating, what are you eating? And and sorry, it's always the individual that's going to be labeling it. So what are you eating? And they say cake. So immediately after the cake is done, you would ask, what did you eat? Then you might ask it again after the party. Initially, you might be showing to help with this. This isn't something that comes from their study, but what I do is also take a picture of the object, and I'll show it immediately. Like when I ask the question right after, I also show the item, and then you fade that. So you show the item, and then you show the back. Like if you've taken the picture and you have a hard copy of it, you show the back of it the next time you ask the question. With the phone, I'll do the same thing. Like I'll take a picture of it on my phone, and have the parent do it, show it to the child when I'm asking the question. They answer in the presence of the picture, and then I start to, like, the next time I ask it with the phone turned around. Transfer trials can be helpful there as well. So you say, you're holding up your phone so the child sees the picture, and you say, what did you eat? And they see cake, and they say cake, and then you immediately turn the phone around or put it down and say, what did you eat? And they say cake immediately after. And then another strategy that Dr. Axe and his team has come up with is a problem-solving strategy where you teach the child how to recall by teaching them explicitly to engage in like self-talk about it. So the type of self-talk specifically is self-questioning. They're taught to make a picture of what happened in their head and then ask themselves questions about it. So now moving away from just different verbal operands or different functions of communication that we want to teach. So, we've talked about teaching requesting, labeling, and intraverbals. Now we'll talk about how to expand mean length of utterance or how to teach word combination. I like to do it first in the context of requesting, not necessarily always. I'll sometimes do it with labeling. So when I'm doing this, I avoid carrier phrases. So I avoid I want. I should also go back to, I don't know if you guys remember in that picture, that video of the child, he was doing I see blank, and that comes from PECs. They teach you in phase, I believe it's 6, where you're doing commenting to have the child say I see. And they talk about that being important because there's no intonation available with a picture, or even when you're selecting on a device at this point on this SGD, to help the listener know what you're trying to say. But there's also, points against the use of carrier phrases. So at this point, I don't teach them. Instead, I will teach for requesting verb object as one of my early ones, or attribute object. So I do activities where the same verb is combined with multiple nouns. Or activities where you can combine the same noun with multiple attributes. And I know, like, I'm talking mostly about what, not talking so much about what we do with the AAC device, but I'll get into that after I've talked about the strategy for teaching the word combination itself. So this activity with the cut, I'll do it by, what that picture is at the end there. Oh, okay, that's a picture of the sentence strip or the visual aid. So this is an activity where I'm having the child combine cut with various nouns. And to create motivation for it, what I'll sometimes do is, use those like Velcro fruit, Velcro vegetables, and I put like 3 in a bin, for example. So the child may initially not want to cut them, but they're going to cut the 3 vegetables to get a reinforcer at the end, to get a reward at the end. And now that they've contacted, that reinforcement, they've also contacted the fun of engaging in the activity, they're more likely to do it in the future. While they're doing it, so initially they just cut it and then get their reinforcer. Then I place demand on communication. So it becomes, I'm holding the broccoli. They have the carrot and the apple, they cut both, and now they know they need to cut the apple. And so they'll say, cut apple. So that's how I create the motivation for that. Usually we'd want to teach the verb that we're going to use on its own first. So just cut, like all they have to do is tell us to cut. Maybe we're the ones who cut, or like we're controlling access to the knife and they say cut, they get the knife. I talked about creating motivation for it. Yeah, we talked about those pieces. And then, oh, sorry. So that this picture was for the last one with the cutting. Now we are on to attributes. So colors is like an easy one to start with. I find it's quite a bit easier to start with that than size, for example. Um, it's hard to create situations though where the child wants it. Like occasionally you have a child who likes different kinds of chocolate and they like the brown chocolate but not the white chocolate. Those are great. If you don't have those kinds of activities, or if you just need more because you've taught white chocolate, but now you want to teach a whole bunch of other colors. I like to do matching activities. I think I mentioned that before. So, but before I was talking about it with just using the attribute, here we would be using the attribute plus noun because we're looking for a word combination. So I give them like, there's 5 things to match. I give them 4. Now they're missing the purple dinosaur. In this case, they're missing the green star. So they would request likely they might just say star. And so I'd be holding up like, I'd make sure that I have an extra purple, for example. So they've already got purple. Now I'm holding up purple and green. I say, which one? And I do that because I want to be careful that I don't start to teach them to make these 2-word requests when it wouldn't be appropriate to. So if we were holding up a pen, and it was black, but that was the only pen that I'm holding, and you want my pen, you're not going to say, "Can I have your black pen?" You'll say, "Can I have the pen?" So we want to teach them that the time to use these attributes is when you're trying to specify which of some objects you want. That's why in this activity, I'd purposely have like 2 purples. So they've already put 1 purple on, but now I have another purple that they don't need, so that they need to say green star. And then the visual aid there is to remind them to say it. So I'll point to the blank. So they might say star, and then I'll point to the blank, and they say green, and then I point to star. They say star, and then I fade that out. I might fade it to using the back of it where the word star is not there, and then stop using it. Frampton et al. Has done a couple, at least 2 studies, I believe, on use of matrix training. Similar to what I've been talking about, but they've been talked about using it for labeling. And the word matrix, they use that because of how they set up ahead of time the exemplars that they're going to use. So they have a grid where they have a few subjects. In this case, there's 3, and then they have a few verbs. And what they would teach to the child would be a diagonal there. So they'll teach mom sleeping, dad eating, Jack reading. And then from there, the other ones are treated as like generalization. When they teach it, how I had this blank because I'm trying to get the child to say green on their own and add star to it. I try to do that from the start. I don't do like an echo. They do, and they've had success with it. So I wouldn't say not to do it. I wonder, maybe another line of research could be trying to do it without echoing, where you're from the start, having them put together the word combinations. They do make an effort to make sure they're only using they only use mom because they've taught mom as a label on its own, and they've taught sleeping as a label on its own. Now they're combining them. So questions when we're doing this with an SGD. So, we're doing this with a child where we're not expecting them to be saying it. We're expecting them to be selecting 2 buttons. How best to do that? Do we want those 2 buttons to be on the same page? Does that not matter? That will vary from learner to learner. A way to think about it though, like when you're trying to think of what your learner needs to do, a task analysis would be like this. So if it was dog jumping, they have to, let's say they're on the home page, they have to select the animals linking button, select dog. Now they have to go back to home. Then they have to select actions to get jump. And then if you also want them to be conjugating it, which would come later, but if you did, that would be another button tap. Or another keystroke. So it can get very complicated. And so for a child that may not tolerate having to wait in between their steps, doesn't tolerate a lot of prompting, doesn't tolerate frustration, you might want to have the 2, make sure that your 2 buttons are on the same page initially. And then you can move them. You might add a button on a page where it may not belong, put it there, and then move it back to where it belongs once they get better at this word combination idea. Oh, I had put that there just so I'll run through it again, to show how complicated it could be. So we've got to go animals at the top. They select dog. Now we have to come back to this homepage. Now to come back to the homepage may not be a keystroke because depending on how you set it up, you can set it up with a snapback. That's what they call it on Proloquo. Or what you're trying to do is tell the device that once an item is selected, you always go back to the homepage. Or you can sometimes tell it to go back to the page before you set that up as you want. So there you reduce a keystroke. Okay, so how do we decide what vocabulary to teach when? What are we going to target? We want to consider it in the context of the learner's overall learning profile. I have a big exclamation mark there because often I'll get like a family or they're referred by somebody and they just say, we want to work on AAC. And even I'll kind of forget, when we're doing the assessment, like, wait a minute, this is part of their whole language, and not just language, this is part of their like whole life. So we want more information than just what do we know about their AAC skills. So we want to know their whole profile if we can. So we can get that from the VB map. For an older learner, like 9+, we might get that information from the APLs or from the EFL. And I'll spend quite a bit of time on that with older learners especially, because with a younger learner, we can go, the vocabulary we're going to teach is being taught initially. Like we definitely select things that are of high interest to them, but also we might then go into tacting or labeling, and we're teaching tacting of common nouns and maybe common verbs. For an older learner, where the likelihood of moving from that to expanding to all language is lower. And so we need to move very quickly into teaching them the vocabulary that are important to them. So I want to know very quickly, like at the beginning, what are the contexts in which communication is going to happen? And what does the individual already love doing? Or what are they already good at doing? Maybe, some chores they don't love doing, but they'll do them, they get dressed, for example. But where is language a barrier? So in what activity is the learner already proficient or close to, or what do they really enjoy, and where in that is language a barrier? And that helps us to select the targets. Thinking about that behaviorally, basically we're looking at like what behavior chains already exist. Can the individual already make a sandwich? Can they take a shower? Okay, now let's build vocabulary into those activities. Oh wow, we're done quite early. Oh my. Are there any questions?